Welcome to Sweetspot Safari. I'm Ben. This is John, and we welcome today Holly Notcutt as our explorer. Today we'll be exploring the theme settle and travel. So Holly and I were introduced a few weeks ago, and we've had quite a few conversations. Most of them too short. We kind of connected really around all things youth and social action, and some really interesting conversations. And I thought you'd be an awesome guest, Holly, because I think you're wrestling with quite a few challenges, which we're trying to also wrestle with on Sweetspot Safari. And there was quite a few to pick from, but the one we've chosen today really is settle and travel. And so settle and travel to me means perhaps also, on the one hand, establishing a home, but also being able to explore new territory. And I think there's always this kind of trade-off between, basically exploiting your current context and finding new pastures. And mentioned it just before we came on here. Should I stay or should I go? Is quite an interesting connection to a song which highlights this. But yeah, before we go in, Holly, I think just a quick introduction to you and your work with Volunteering Matters and the I Will movement, and just to give a little bit of context, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So I'm employed through Volunteering Matters. I've been in the organisation for 2 years now, and really I've got sort of a weird role in the organisation because I'm one of the people who help to coordinate what's called the I Will movement, which is a UK-wide movement kind of coordinated in partnership with another organisation and loads of organisations really across the UK. Being a movement, it's not about like control from one cockpit or anything, and it's really all about putting the spotlight on young people and youth social action. So youth social action, as we kind of understand it, is anything that young people do with their time to have a positive impact on society, so on other people or on the environment. And in some contexts that could look like being a member of the youth parliament, and in other contexts it could be someone who actively and regularly checks on a neighbour, for instance, and everything in between. So for us, the I Will movement, which has been running for about 10 years, is really all about how can we ensure that there's a greater kind of spotlight on the hyper-local, street-level youth social action that we know happens all over the UK, all over the world, actually, but is often overlooked or underseen. And I think certainly there could be a lot more to be done around really listening to young people's experiences and their insights to kind of contribute to making change. So that's my work on a personal level. My background's in broader community development in the voluntary sector and in the public sector as well. And I grew up and still live in Great Yarmouth, which is a little seaside town on the east coast of Norfolk, if you fancy a little holiday. And yeah, I think this settle and travel agenda is really kind of personal to me and relevant to work as well, when we're thinking about young people's role in shaping society, and importantly around their role in shaping their communities, their hometowns.
No, thanks for that, Holly. And I think so as part of your movement, Ipswich became a designated town for social action, I think last year, and it made me reflect on my journey to where I am now. So I can just remember, my teenage years, kind of just wanting to move out of home and move out of the area which I grew up with or grew up in. I didn't go to university, and so I spent quite a lot of time just going to different places where friends were staying in universities, really from the south coast to Scotland. And so I was kind of traveling. I was traveling, a lot between all these different places, and also at the weekends, I used to love going out in London. And I lived in London for about 10 years. And I kind of just, it got to a point where I realized that actually I was probably running away. I felt like my life was really running away from the neighborhood and the place where I grew up. And then I came back to Ipswich about 6 years ago. But there was still obviously this pull. There was this kind of pull to return to Ipswich, which is my hometown. And yeah, I'd like your kind of personal reflections on some of the decisions at a personal level you took to, either think about staying or going to places other than Great Yarmouth.
Yeah. So I guess growing up here, um, I think, we were all, myself and my peers and my siblings, we were all quite aware of, I suppose, some of the negative kind of associations that towns like Yarmouth have, which I think both we heard, and I think probably also, if speaking honestly, we probably perpetuated them as well. I think we probably talked about how Yarmouth was like, not a great place to grow up, not enough things to do, it's doesn't have enough money, there's not enough opportunities, all those sorts of things. And I think we were kind of like, yeah, just sort of perhaps unconsciously replaying that narrative, and not really thinking about what that actually meant, or what opportunities were there beyond the ones that we were told were important. So when I got to about 18, I kind of was just on a little bit of a conveyor belt. I think I went to school, I went to college, and then I went to university outside of East Anglia. Um, and I think I was a bit indifferent, actually. I'd come home in semester breaks. I'd bring friends home from my university, which incidentally was also a small town, Loughborough, in the Midlands. And I kind of liked that. I was almost a bit scared of moving to the city, being a bit of a small town person. And yeah, I was really quite sort of keen to bring my friends back and things like that. And then after university finished, I think I wasn't quite ready to have a job, actually, and did it sort of 2 or 3 years of sort of working and traveling overseas. And during that time, I did do a little bit of volunteering in local communities. And I think those experiences for me were the ones that really kind of made me value communities and sort of local priorities, I suppose, and the ways in which small actions can have a positive impact on a community and really on a place. And this is before I had any of this language.
Mm.
I think also, you can work and travel as a young adult and sort of tick off all the sites. And I realized quite quickly that I wasn't interested in going to all these landmark destinations. I was actually more interested in finding the small towns, finding the Yarmouths, getting a library card, and spending time in sort of super local places that provided me a bit of an insight into someone's day to day. I wasn't interested in the flashy stuff. I was much more interested in small town goings on, so going to community meetings, volunteered at a local school, and did some other bits and bobs along the way. And I think when I then returned after, it was nearly 3 years, I was like, oh God, what am I going to do? I found myself in my childhood bedroom in Yarmouth at 25, and sort of thinking, well, I suppose this is when I'm supposed to move to London. I suppose this is where I'm supposed to get that job that makes me, look like I'm important, that gives me some sort of status that there was an expectation, I suppose, around. And so, but wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, and applied for some jobs and had a serendipitous meeting with a friend who I had known from sixth form college, who was working in Yarmouth. We met on a train just randomly, and he was saying, oh, I'm glad you're back. And when I was explaining the sorts of things that mattered to me that I'd seen around the world, and that was kind of trying to find in this world of work that I didn't know anything about, he said, oh, that sounds a bit like what I do. And he was working for a small charity in Yarmouth, a community development charity. And he said, oh, we've got a job for a community development worker. We've got a vacancy, deadline's tomorrow. And I got that job, and that really was the start of me kind of peeling back all the layers of stereotype and all the pathologizing like narrative around Yarmouth, and really starting to understand what Yarmouth really was, without dismissing its challenges, but also kind of really kind of seeing for the first time its strengths and reasons for living here, really. And so by getting that job, it kind of helped me make that decision to settle. And that was the start of my kind of continued journey around really sort of you know, understanding the roles that we can all play in you know, creating stronger communities in the places that we live, and why it's important to sort of understand places that you're really told to leave, understand how you actually not only can stay, but the things that you can do as part of a wider network of people who are all bringing something different and all equally as valuable to sort of help change emerge in terms of positive improvements on, you know, some of the statistics and inequalities, I suppose.
So I've got a follow-on question, if that's okay, Holly, because I think, you know, this is absolutely fascinating, and it's clear to me that you've gone on a journey, and you've come back to where you know, you started, because you've had some events, points through your career, your transition from, you know, being at college to university, going away and coming back, and those triggers have sort of, for want of a better word, you know, either reinforced or emboldened your desire to come back. But not everybody is in that position, and this is one of the things that's, you know, sort of challenging my brain, because as you've alluded to, we know there's a lot of social deprivation in seaside towns, not just in the east, but in the west, in the north, and everywhere else. And as you said, there's this perception of not much for young people. What I really want to know is, you know, what is it for the people who don't have those triggers? You know, you've had it because you've had that exposure, and you've got clearly some internal motivation, you know, for making social change. But not everybody is in that position. So what do we do about those people? Because we don't want those left by the wayside, you know. Because what I've, you know, having worked in Lowestoft for a spell, which is not far away from Yarmouth, and some of the conversations I've had with the youth, is that this sort of level of, dare I say, not necessarily deprivation, but lack of opportunity, triggers apathy, right? And that's what, you know, sort of concerns me, and I'm sure it concerns others, you know. And this whole business about the debate, you know, do we travel, do we settle, or what do we do to get around, dare I say, a potential negative spiral? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's complex, I think, and I think but I think there's a huge issue with I suppose some of the things that we're told as a society that matter, and the things that we're told as a society that will bring you know, positive life improvements, whatever you want to kind of call things like. So economic growth, I think, is an obsession for a lot of people, and I understand the importance of a healthy economy, but I think there's quite a sort of a specific dominant view around what a good economy is or should be. You know, high wages and other things. I'm not an economist, so I won't try and pretend I know the exact kind of elements of that. But I think there's a slight obsession with, you know, let's build that factory. Let's, you know, kind of build it and they will come kind of mentality. You know, if we've got big businesses, then that will sort out everything. So obviously, I guess that's then a trigger. You know, the trickle down economics thing, which personally, as someone who's worked in community development generally for, you know, just under 20 years, and seen initiatives like that kind of come and go and hasn't changed anything. And I know there are wider kind of environmental circumstances and forces at play, but really hasn't made any difference, and in fact things are worse, I think it's kind of almost helps to prove the point that those that kind of mentality isn't the thing that creates change. But I think what's strong about those approaches is that they are tangible. Often they're visible. Often when you're putting in a new factory or a new offshore energy building or whatever it might be, I think people, because they can see it, there's that, everyone crosses their fingers and hopes that this is the thing that's going to make the difference. Whereas a sort of an investment in social infrastructure rather than physical infrastructure, I think is the thing that makes the significant difference. But you can't see it. It's difficult to measure, and it's not kind of quick. It's not just sort of lay the bricks and then it's built. It's something that not only takes time, but it's really difficult to see and quantify, and you might experience it but you don't know you're experiencing it, and so on. So I think there's, in terms of like how, your question around how do we sort of turn the lights on for people who perhaps don't quite realize the benefits of see some of these positivities. I think there's no one way. I think we're all individual people, and to some extent everyone will experience and have their lights turned on in different ways. But I think there's a few things that I think are needed in the mix of whatever approach it is that you take that are kind of quite critical. I think there's something about system leaders, whoever it is who's in charge of making decisions in towns, kind of by and large, around the language that they use, and some of their practices and their values. So I think, and I was really guilty of this when I first started in community development. I would always say, we live in a deprived community. Yarmouth is poor old Yarmouth, we're really bad because of this, we're pretty bad. And whereas once I started to realize that actually that was kind of contributing to the narrative, it was then kind of contributing to everyone's kind of feelings about the place.
I see. So negative tags have a detrimental effect, effectively.
I think so. Just as I think positive tags this isn't one big comms exercise, obviously. It's more complicated than that. But I do think that, when you start to think about the positives of a place, and you start to kind of own those and celebrate those, you can start to change that narrative, I think, that's not going to immediately create jobs or immediately make someone want to sort of put down their roots, but I think it does help. So a cultural change, I suppose. So when you think about the strengths of a town, maybe it might be it's I don't know, it's history, it's special things that have happened there. And some friends of mine a few years ago wrote out a whole list of all of these amazing things that people didn't know about Great Yarmouth. And I think just even sharing those sometimes can make people feel proud of who they are and where they live, even if it's just for a minute or two. That's more than they were feeling yesterday. And I think also then it's also about those who aren't here. The amount of people who live in Norwich who say, oh, why do you live in Yarmouth? It's almost like that's the place to live. If you want to live locally, if you really must, you should really live in Norwich, because that's the more sort of, the place with more opportunities and so on. And so with that narrative sort of being maintained as being negative, then not only do local people embody that ultimately, or at risk of embodying that, but so does that become the truth to those outside of the town as well. And I think with regard to sort of apathy, I think that's a really complicated, complex kind of question as well, because I think there's a lot of I think the term apathy is often used perhaps too quickly by some, because of a failed initiative. Sometimes there's a, I don't know, an employment and skills initiative focused on young people and it didn't do that well, and well, there's too much apathy in the town. And I always get a little bit riled by that, I think, because I think, well, because your approach didn't work, let's not blame young people, let's not blame local residents. This is a complicated thing. If initiatives worked that well, then we wouldn't have a problem in the first place, because we just roll out a project. So there's a responsibility for those who are working in towns like Yarmouth and Ipswich, and certainly those who are system leaders who are living there as well, to sort of, recognise that social change doesn't just happen because you've got a big shiny new building or a big shiny new project. It's something that emerges over time, and you all have to be kind of on the same boat with the same vision on the horizon. But the sea is wide and there's no one way to get there, and I think that's okay as well. I think the acceptance that there's no one route, there shouldn't be one route, the multiple routes and the things that we find on those routes are the things that actually help to create the change and explore new positivities, which you wouldn't find if you're in A to B linear sausage machine sort of input output project that you're crossing your fingers and hoping will be the thing that creates the change.
So I get that. It's very interesting. So I've got some follow-ons, but I'm going to leave it for the moment, because what I'd like to do is bring Ben in to reflect as well on that, because you've very kindly, Holly, triggered some thought processes as well around systems that I'd like to come back on later on. But Ben, your reflections.
Well, yeah, I think one thing which jumped out to me was thinking about the fairly infamous levelling up agenda now, which seems to be about kind of investing in kind of places, and I think the challenges, although kind of good intentions, I think the challenges of just seeing it purely as infrastructure projects, perhaps, as kind of building things to opportunities and whatnot. That's a kind of superficial surface layer. It's an intention, but the social capital piece is really important. And so so I think that it's difficult to pin down. As you say, it's difficult to quantify. It takes a long time. No single one person can take the accolades for it. So it kind of really goes against the way that we deliver change and think about change nowadays. So I think that was a really spot on point. And I guess just casting back to the youth perspective, I kind of think of young people, and you hear the stories. Don't know what the average ages are of young people, spending more and more time at home, and so the property ladder is becoming ever further away, and they're spending more and more time at home. That may work with some. It probably doesn't work for a lot. And I don't know what that will mean, for future generations. It's going to change the dynamic. It's going to change the social fabric. I think. I don't know. I've got no clear ideas in what ways, but it feels like a postcode lottery. Because actually, if you're spending more and more time at home, if you're in a great place where you've got amenities, everywhere around you. You kind of got great schools, great play areas. You got friends, you got lots of opportunities, leisure, work, whatever. Not so bad. If you're in somewhere else where you've got the exact opposite of that, and your impulse is to travel and to explore, but you simply can't do it because the financial circumstances don't allow you. we're kind of pushing people into settling, you know, where actually maybe we should be creating more choices to explore and to try things. So yeah, it's just that dynamic of just younger people spending more and more time at home, being more and more dependent on parents, and obviously that's going to change things going forward. So that was just one reflection. I don't know if you want to speak to that. And
yeah, I mean, it's I think it's almost like at the moment it's not really been explored, has it? There's a sort of from time to time you hear about young people staying at home and not being able to get on the property ladder, or not being able to rent their own home because of rental prices, or not being able to get a council property because there aren't enough council homes. But it almost feels like the conversation around young people having to live at home for longer is kind of just that. And actually, you're totally right. It's much broader than that. It's potentially forcing young people to stay where they are, and then the things that they are able to access directly are completely dependent on their location and their postcode. So I don't know. I think in some ways, obviously, it kind of almost drives more inequalities, and whatever we call, social mobility or whatever, it can almost potentially sort of cements people into whatever rung of the social mobility ladder they happen to be on, if we're sort of sticking with that kind of analogy. But I don't know. I think if we are, and this is about sort of multiple things happening at the same time, but I think, if there are more reasons for, if young people are kind of almost forced to stay at home longer, does that potentially mean, I'm a little bit of an optimist, does that potentially mean that there is an increased likelihood for people who perhaps thought they needed to be elsewhere, let alone wanted to be, like me, I thought I needed to be in London, or not here. If you're kind of forced economically to stay at home for longer, does that then potentially mean that you are, and this is, I guess, where social action comes in potentially, if there's something that you care about, and care about enough to do something about, the potential for doing something locally is quite great in terms of accessibility, but also seeing the impact, and seeing the multifaceted impact as well. I think potentially on your community, the things that you might not have imagined it would impact. And I know it's a little bit rose tinted, and I'm absolutely not championing young people staying at home for longer for the reasons that they currently are having to, but just trying to see some of the potential opportunities there. But it isn't just about young people sort of dusting themselves down and getting out into their local village or sleepy seaside town. I think it's much more, there's a huge responsibility on local systems to, again, change that narrative, and saying, you know what, actually there's lots to do here if we think differently, if we think together, if we listen to one another, and we kind of walk arm in arm on some of this stuff. So creating an enabling environment for local people to kind of create and shape change, I think, is quite critical, and particularly with young people, and particularly with young people in this kind of who find themselves in this situation, I think.
So I'm finding this fascinating, so Ben, because I'd really like to come in on this one, because I want to come back to Holly on the system leaders and that, because I think that's really important. But before I do that, I want to go back to your point about leveling up, right? Because I think, if we think about Sweetspot Safari, one of our objectives is, as well as trying to find collaboration where potentially it doesn't exist or perceived not to exist, and polarities, We've also talked about stratification of data and the importance of using, and again, Holly alluded to it, using the right language and not being overly simplistic with very complex and faceted problems. So if we look at levelling up at the moment, is that the term, I agree with you, Holly, is quite glib at the moment. And the problem is it's also unidimensional because it looks at just resources. But I'd like to wind back in history based on some of my experiences and look at two places that I've lived and worked. One is Leeds, and the other one is up in Teesside, right? So if you look at, first of all, Teesside, massive social deprivation based on the virtual collapse of the coal industry, which affected, of course, South Wales, right? Northeast of England, literally struggled overnight. But and same with shipbuilding in Newcastle and Gateshead and Sunderland and stuff. But they'd also have a very, or perceived, and I'm not there to judge or not judge, a massively strong work ethic. And this is why I alluded to the point about apathy. And that work ethic, right, basically meant, bring it on, bring us the work. So in the mid-80s, the whole of that area around Durham, right, was transformed. You've got Nissan moving up there with car factories. You've got Hitachi going to Durham electronics factories and stuff like that. And again, they've just gone through another negative cycle with the end of the Redcar Steelworks in Teesside, but they're regenerating that now as well. So I think there is an opportunity. And my point being there is, it's not just about financial resources, right? It's about diversity as well. You can put investment in, as you've said, it's not just about money. And the reason I say that is you look at somewhere like Leeds, for instance, right? Which again was traditionally cloth town, mill town, manufacturing town. And it is now a very, very vibrant city. One of the reasons was there was a conscious decision by government to devolve the government. People talk about devolved government, and it's not, if we're honest about it, it's not really worked that well in the UK. And bringing, administrative offices from London, for instance. London was seen as the financial capital and all this, and it's just been we've been very London-centric in that area, and moving it to places like Leeds. So HSBC moved their headquarters to Leeds and things like the other. And that has generated some vibrancy around that area. So I'm saying it's not just about financial resources and throwing money at infrastructure. It's about, what you bring, right? And by creating more diverse and new communities, by bringing different types of industries into those sort of areas. So I think it's really, that's a point of reflection. And again, you guys might have some thoughts on that. But I think your point about systems leaders is also very well made. And I'm going to ask you a question, Holly. When you look at systems leaders, right, and you've mentioned about youth and youth involvement, which is very important, do you feel that there's some intergenerational problems or stress because the people who are making the decisions around the communities are from a different generation and they don't fully understand what the youth require? And therefore, if the youth were more involved in the decision-making processes and the agenda setting and the culture, that would have a huge impact on success?
In some ways, I don't think it's quite as kind of cut and dry as that, because I don't think it's sort of as much as, adults not knowing what young people want, because I think there's a risk that we can kind of almost turn that into a, well, you said we did sort of thing, which kind of drives me nuts a little bit. When you see it kind of happen, we consult with the community, we consult with young people, they said they wanted this, so we've done it. And I think that approach is sort of, it's just missing the mark. I think it's completely like misunderstanding kind of what's needed. What I think young people bring, it's not a wish list by any stretch of the imagination. And in fact, I don't think they necessarily want different things to anybody else. I think everyone wants somewhere to call home. I think everyone wants to be able to feel safe. I think everyone wants to feel cared for and be able to care for others. Some fundamental, I suppose, human things. And I think when it boils down to that, everyone wants to feel secure, have enough money. I don't think there's anyone who's really saying, I want to be a billionaire. Maybe a few, but so everyone, I think, just wants to feel safe, have somewhere to call home, be able to live comfortably, be able to be happy, be able to feel cared for and care for others. I think they're the fundamentals. And so therefore then what is it that young people want? It's almost, I think, the wrong kind of question or kind of road to go down. Like there's some magic request that young people have that, you know, councils have completely overlooked. So what I think is that the sort of the system leaders as we know them, so the people who head up the councils and the NHS and police and all the other kind of statutory services and voluntary sector services that are all kind of part of a local area partnership or something. I think actually really almost, I think one of our jobs really is to think about how can we almost reframe, relabel that in a way, because really their role is about being a sister, being an enabler, I think, because I think thinking about sort of social infrastructure versus physical capital investments, physical infrastructure, I think the experiences that come through local people taking action on the things that matter to them, and young people, their social action, their experiences and insights provide the nuance or like a window onto something that someone working in the council might not have thought about before. So it's less about a consultation and much more about a respectful, equitable, and importantly ongoing dialogue and a commitment to that forever, really, if we're gonna be kind of frank about it, because this isn't about a project. This is about saying, you know, young people and communities are the people that have to be in the center of all of these decisions that are made. And I'm not saying everything needs to be done en masse and everything needs to be a citizens' assembly on every decision. Of course, that's unworkable. But if we're not creating a space for the insights and experiences of local people, then we will always be reliant on the people who perhaps we traditionally call, because really that's system leadership. It's feeding in the things that matter on a day-to-day basis that will gradually over time aggregate to being the change that we can see and measure, and then we can look back in 10 years and think, gosh, haven't we come a long way? But I think those things are granular, and it's only by kind of creating the conditions for those things to emerge that that the systems really change. So actually what we perhaps accidentally, unconsciously call the system leaders, the men in suits that run the power structures, really, if we start to look at them as system enablers, system activists almost, then, and I'd read about this somewhere, I can't quite remember, so I can't quite quote it, but then actually we create the space for people who aren't in a lane to start to kind of inform what that picture should look like. Because I think if you're in health, your lane is health, and that's what you predominantly see, and for all the right reasons that we know, or if you're in policing, you know, you will be thinking about community safety predominantly. So we have to create an environment where the intersecting and interdependent elements are all able to kind of come together, and we have to be comfortable with the fact that we definitely can't control that, nor should we want to, but that does require people taking their hands off the steering wheel a little bit and seeing where the car goes. And so I think that's something that we have to start to explore and start to probe a little bit.
I find that absolutely fascinating, because you're talking about enablers and catalysts for change, and potentially, you know, your analogy about getting your hands off the steering wheel and getting out the lanes is what I find really interesting, because what you're talking about then is allowing maybe the more creative people, the more rounded thinking people to influence more and cross the boundaries and see those interdependencies and allow them to happen. So I guess, and there's always this chicken and egg argument, isn't there, with people and systems, is what would you see as the catalyst for that sort of change? You know, what's going to make that environment happen?
I don't know. That's the honest answer. I don't think anyone really knows, but I think we can try. And I think that by being kind of driven by values around equity and anti-discrimination and social justice and things like that are a good start. And I think when you can encourage our system enablers to think sort of specifically about some of those things. So if we're thinking about equity and sharing power with young people, for instance, because at the moment there's not that many young people sitting in every single council meeting and every single NHS board meeting, really. So actually, if we are, you know, one thing that we can do, which won't make the total difference, but it is a bit of the recipe, is organizations starting to revisit their values and think, actually, are we really being inclusive? Are we really sharing power? Are we being equitable? Are we really driven by social justice? And if we are, what should that look like if we were an organization that was living and breathing those values? If we say that we care about them, and they're in most people's mission statements, aren't they? But what would we really look like if we were an organization that were absolutely living and breathing those things? And then what's one thing that we can do to progress on that? What's one commitment that we can make to start to kind of get on that road? And who's missing, actually? Who's missing from the room? Who's missing from the conversations? Who's missing from the spaces where decisions are made? And go out and find them. And that isn't easy, but it's critical to do that.
Yeah, and I think I definitely appreciate your honesty. You know, with the, I don't know, we don't say that enough. And as you say, the kind of intention of just trying things. There's an element of faith that things will work if you keep trying, which I like. But just one quick question before we round up, Holly. We haven't mentioned technology, and I think technology has a huge impact on whether we settle or travel. You could argue that the invention of the car and allowed us to explore well beyond our community boundaries 100 or so years ago. So work wasn't really what we did necessarily within the community. It became a place which we travel to, and in kind of industrial states, or so many people probably commute 1 or 2 hours a day, or although less since COVID. So yeah, just some reflections on the rise of virtual working and being able to settle at home, but if you like, virtually travel to other destinations, across the UK or kind of beyond. And what are some of the kind of pros and cons that young people have in this new digitally enabled space?
Loads of thoughts. I'm very kind of pro technology and very grateful personally for technology. As someone who's chosen to settle in sort of little old Yarmouth, there, if I'm honest, there have been huge amounts of times where I've sort of questioned my decision. Could I be in a different job, a better job? Could I be earning more money? All of these things that unfortunately I've had all of these kind of thoughts. And being able to work virtually, obviously, which was massively speeded up by the pandemic, enabled me to to get into this job, which historically probably would have been a job that would have been based in London, which would require you to live in London. And, you know, I made the decision to settle here. So therefore, this job and hundreds, thousands of other jobs would not have been accessible to me. So I think from obviously from an employability kind of standpoint, technology's been transformational. But I think when we think about young people, and it kind of goes back to this sort of apathy word a little bit, I think, you know, there is that like that statement, that saying that people say you can't be what you can't see and all of that sort of stuff. And I don't entirely believe that, but at the same time, you know, there is some truth to that. And but there is a word which I don't know, I can't remember it. In fact, I'm not sure I've ever kind of grasped it, but there's a word that's in the German language, which is I can't remember if I told you about this, Ben, but it's something that came about, I think, after the Berlin Wall came down. And it was something that people in West Germany would say about people who were formerly living in East Germany. And there was something about people's mentality, how they saw the world, how they behaved. And the word, I mean, this is with a bit of a caveat that I can't quite remember the precise details of it, but I think it's important. The word was something to the equivalent of you can't see beyond the wall. So people who were in the East Germany weren't able to see beyond the wall, so therefore they had no real kind of understanding or comprehension of the opportunities and possibilities that people who were on the Western side were experiencing. And so when we think about technology and think about the UK and think about young people, particularly young people who are, you know, geographically kind of isolated or marginalized from places where there are the big kind of opportunity centres, largely the cities or the transport links, what technology I think enables is that ability to see over the wall. So you could have a young person in Yarmouth who might have only ever lived every day of their life in Yarmouth, and there are lots of young people who've never been to London, never been to Norwich, which is a 40-minute drive away, who have essentially lived with a wall around them, well, in fact, the sea on one side and the wall on the other side. And so but what technology has started to enable, obviously social media, but then thinking about the growth in opportunities with technology like we're using now, all of a sudden a young person who's, you know, doing social action, maybe just, you know, just doing it for the first time here, might have the opportunity to see what someone is doing in Blackpool or another kind of comparable town that they would otherwise have no direct access to. You know, getting to Blackpool for me would be hard, and I drive a car and can buy a train ticket, let alone a young person who hasn't got those opportunities to sort of travel. So by seeing what someone else does who lives in a similar town to me, who might look like me, who has a similar day-to-day experience as me, and they're doing something that I've never thought of doing, helps to see over the wall a little bit. And so that's why I'm saying I have a little bit of a tussle with the word apathy, because sometimes I think a lot of the time it isn't because people can't be bothered, it's because some of these other structures and forces that kind of push people into the corner and you know, and block the view. So I think one of the things that we want to do, one of the reasons we're trying to build a movement across the UK, is how can we spotlight what's happening in Blackpool so that the young person on my street might be more likely to see it than perhaps they would have before, you know, largely digitally, largely through social media.
I love the beyond the wall analogy. I mean, it's almost a bit inverted from the grass is greener on the other side, you know, in one respect. But if you look at it that way, but I was really fascinated while you were talking, because I was thinking about, again, technology, how much of an enabler it really is, you know, not just looking at what other people are doing regarding social action, but if you look at, you know, I remember when I was out in Russia once, I saw the famous, you know, Maslow hierarchy of needs, you know, where you've got, you know, they had a food, water, sex, shelter, etc. at the bottom, and then, you know, you work up towards self-actualization, but somebody had written at the bottom Wi-Fi and internet, you know, as the cornerstone for that, because that has also enabled people in their attic rooms to become crypto entrepreneurs, try not just see on the other side of the wall, but actually do it as well as see it, which never have been trained for. You know, in order to be that sort of entrepreneur, you wind the clock back 20, 30 years, you would have had to have gone into London or Manchester or Leeds or somewhere and sat in an office with a powerful computer to go and do that. So I think that in itself is really powerful. But again, going back, it was interesting what you were talking about, you know, giving the youth access to power and influence, you know, when you were talking about the system leaders and the structures. Another thing that got me thinking is, you know, I'm a big fan of lean and Japanese technology and empowerment being pushed down the organization, you know, as long as people are trained and given the resources and there's quality control. What I see a lot when you look at administrative structures, and you talked about, just as examples, you know, the police and the NHS and other things as well, and councils, is there's a huge amount of bureaucracy involved in that, which I think is disenfranchising, it's disabling, it potentially generates apathy because people feel disenfranchised, and that just wading through treacle, and that, you know, the fact that it's very difficult, and even not understanding what the rules and regulations are and the frameworks are in order to get things done can be unbelievably frustrating. And I just wonder whether in those systems, you know, if there's a way to remove bureaucracy, you know, through collaboration and enablement and getting rid of some of the unnecessary complexity of bureaucracy, that would be so enabling and so powerful and energizing for people to be more involved. You know, Nassim Taleb, the famous mathematician, writes about bureaucracy and technocracy all the time being, you know, almost the devil, which I tend to agree with. So I'm just wondering whether that you see the young people coming across those sort of barriers as well, Holly.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose so. I think I mean, I don't know. I think with bureaucracy, there's I'm not a natural bureaucrat by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, I'm probably the opposite. But although I do have a sort of a certain amount of respect for it to some extent, you know, in fact, it is essentially there, I think, to keep people safe and to make things fair, you know, theoretically. And so obviously it can't be a big free for all, particularly when we're talking about, you know, healthcare and housing and social care and so on. There obviously has to be that bureaucracy, but I think what the bureaucracies need to do, and the institutions, or perhaps what we all need to do as communities that have these institutions around us, is to think about adjusting and adapting and doing things that will I suppose, you know, bureaucracies are quite risk averse for, again, obvious reasons, which then makes it get clogged up, as we know. But, you know, I think if when you have a commitment to collaboration and partnering, and if those commitments are built upon, I suppose, some more social elements of trust and reciprocity and familiarity and all those sorts of things that you tend to get more of at local kind of level, then the opportunity to, or no, not the opportunity, the appetite to take a risk probably is slightly improved, because it isn't just one organization, you know, taking a step closer to a potential cliff edge. It's, you know, it's 10 of you, not a cliff edge, but you know what I mean. The opportunity to try something new, absolutely, to crack open the decision making, to involve people who've never been involved before. Like, oh well, what if this happens? Actually, if there's 6 of you doing it, versus 1 of you doing it, then there's the risk gets
mass.
shared, but you've also got more opportunity for, you mentioned diversity of a system earlier, and actually if there's just one kind of engine and that kind of goes wrong, then you're a goner. But actually if there's 6, you can all plug into your different strengths, your different resources, your different ways of seeing things, even if they are kind of marginal. And so I don't think anyone would deny the benefits of collaborating, even if you just think of the kind of the cost benefits. But I think that potential to take risks and innovate as a network, as a in a collaborative environment is I think there could be more done there. I think there could be greater steps taken there. And that's why I think in Ipswich, with some of the partnerships that are really starting to emerge and grow in Ipswich, and the alliance that's being formed there is super interesting, because I think, for one organisation to share power with young people, it might feel like super risky if you're not a youth organisation or a youth club or whatever already. But if there's 6 of you doing it, all of the opportunities to learn and share, and like that shared risk just creates such a huge opportunity for inching forward in that learning and inching forward in that social mobility change agenda that everyone is kind of hunkering after.
Yeah, I think it's a great point to finish on, Holly. And I think it's a positive and hopeful note to finish on. So yeah, thanks for joining us today. It's been fun exploring young people's world, social action, and also the settle and travel theme, which we could go into it in so many different dimensions. But we tend to close off with just some thoughts about sweet spots. And I've been thinking as we've been going along. There's definitely a few which I've thought about. One is that towns, cities rise and fall, and actually, when a place perhaps looks a little bit downbeaten, artists move in, and kind of the regeneration process takes place, and then as it becomes more established and well known, money moves in, but then over time it becomes sterile and expensive, and it loses its character, and it needs to go through the process again. And I think that understanding that places don't always remain either great or bad or everything in between. Everything's a constant process. Change is a constant. So I was thinking about that, and then I was thinking about lockdown. And the lockdown was basically this huge policy everywhere in the world to settle, to not travel effectively for on and off for a couple of years. And I think that's changed our ideas, and I think it's changed our behavioral patterns quite a lot. And global opportunities for travel, for whatever it might be, was almost like pre-COVID, and now we've kind of forgotten about the local when we've been fascinated with the global. And so I think that the term is maybe globally conscious, locally active, and kind of and I think that the virtual world opens up global opportunities, and maybe we won't be able to travel as much in the future for all sorts of different reasons. And I think that I think one of the key points you hit home was basically involving local people in decision making. And one thing I've seen repeatedly is the idea of 15-minute cities. On the face of it, it sounds great. Creating self-sufficient neighborhoods with less stress, less pollution, all your amenities within walking distance. But on the other hand, it could be seen as taking away personal freedoms, and actually reducing our existence to an arbitrary bureaucratic boundary. And so there's kind of both sides here. But I think what would give me hope is actually if it involves local people, and local people have the knowledge, have the power, have the influence to make decisions about how they want to live in the local area. So I think it's just again, following COVID, do more people want to live in cities or less? And so that difference between city life and rural life, and so we kind of think that actually it's all done and dusted, that this is the way to live, this is the best place to live, but we don't know. Things change.
So Ben, that's a brilliant way to close, and you just triggered something in me. It just reminded me of something which could be a potential sweet spot and de-stressor. Your point about, I was thinking when you were saying when things degrade, the artists move in. I was thinking particularly Berlin and the whole underground artist movement in Berlin. But more importantly, I remember a coaching guru once said to me about 10 years ago, is what we have to do is remember every day things are being born, things are stabilizing, and things are fading away. And I think for that gives me hope too. You talked about hope. It is that I think once you get your head around that and understand that, then life becomes less stressful because you understand what's really going on. I think, Holly alluded to it earlier on, if we think things too much in a linear way, or in a transactional way, that in itself creates stress. So,
yeah. Perfect, John. Well, yeah, listen, thanks again, Holly. It's been a fascinating chat, and thanks, John. Thanks everyone for tuning in to Sweetspot Safari. Until next time, take care and follow us on our YouTube channel. Bye.